So I've been thinking about Dexter Morgan rather a lot lately, which if you're here probably means you have too. And I think there's something a little funny about that. This show has been going for almost 20 years now across multiple series, an upcoming prequel, a divisive, limited run-up in the snow, and somehow it keeps pulling people back in. Resurrection came out in the summer of 2025, and the response was genuinely surprising, I think, even to the people who made it. The kind of surprise where critics who had written the franchise off entirely came back and said, well, all right then. And now here we are with a second season confirmed, a release window pointing toward late 2026, a writer's room that reportedly got to work almost immediately after the finale aired, and a whole pile of fan theories that have been accumulating for months. Tonight, we're going to go through all of it. Every confirmed detail about Season 2, every reasonable theory, every slightly unhinged theory that I still think deserves its moment in the sun, all of it. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this channel is called, well, you're watching it, so you know what it's called. But if you haven't subscribed yet, it would genuinely mean a lot. It's free, it helps more than most people realize, and I make these specifically for nights like this. All right, that's the only time I'll mention it, so. Tonight's format is simple. We're going to start by going back over what happened in Resurrection Season 1. Not a rush summary, just a comfortable walk through the main events, because the theories only really land once you're holding all the pieces. Then we'll move through each major thread for Season 2. The New York Ripper and the man they've cast to play him, the 5-borough killer, the question of what Harrison is becoming, Dexter's landlord blessing, and the theory that the internet basically would not stop repeating about him, where Charlie might have gone, what the ghost of Harry Morgan actually represents at this point in the story. And finally, what the confirmed 3-season plan tells us about where all of this is actually headed. No rush on any of it. That's the whole point. To understand where Season 2 is going, it helps to sit comfortably with where Season 1 actually left us. Not a rushed highlight reel, just a proper walk through the story, because some of the theories that came out of the finale only make sense if you're holding the full picture of what happened. So, let's go back to New Blood for a moment, because Resurrection doesn't really exist without it. New Blood ended in Iron Lake in the snow with Harrison shooting Dexter, which, depending on your feelings about the franchise at that point, was either a satisfying conclusion to a long and complicated story or a deeply frustrating one. A lot of people thought it was the former at the time. A lot of people thought it was the latter. The show had a complicated relationship with its audience by the end of New Blood. It wasn't the car crash of the original Season 8, but it wasn't universally loved either. Harrison pulling the trigger felt decisive. It felt like an ending. And then Resurrection opened, and it wasn't. The first thing the show does is reveal that Dexter survived. He was resuscitated in an emergency room, which, in almost any other context, would feel like a cheat. A showrunner overruling a creative decision for commercial reasons. But the way Resurrection handled it was thoughtful enough that most critics let it go. The argument the show was essentially making was this: Dexter Morgan doesn't get an easy out. He doesn't get to be shot by his son in the snow and quietly fade away. That's too clean for a character who has spent his entire adult life leaving messes that other people have to live inside of. There's something almost poetically cruel about the show refusing to let him die, and the series seem to know that. So Dexter is alive in a hospital, and the first thing he does when he's well enough is go to New York City to find Harrison. New York is a genuinely different texture for this franchise. Miami was hot and saturated and slightly unreal, a place where Dexter's particular kind of darkness could hide in plain sight among the noise of the city. Iron Lake was the opposite, small and cold and intimate, where secrets had nowhere to go. New York sits somewhere interesting in the middle. It's anonymous in the way that only enormous cities can be. You can disappear there in a way that doesn't require effort. You can be anyone, which is obviously quite useful for Dexter Morgan. Harrison is already in the city when Dexter arrives. He's not exactly thrilled about his father showing up. That relationship, father and son, killer and the boy who shot him, the inheritance question that New Blood planted but never fully answered, is the emotional spine of Resurrection's first season. And credit where it's due, the show handles that relationship with more care than I expected. The central antagonist of season 1 is Leon Prater, played by Peter Dinklage. And Prater is a fascinating creation, a billionaire with an obsessive, quasi-romantic fixation on serial killers. Not as a vigilante, not as a copycat, but as a collector and a fanboy. He has files on dozens of active killers. He has relationships with some of them. He's built a kind of private network around his obsession. And he genuinely believes that killers like Dexter are a kind of apex expression of something he finds magnificent, which makes him dangerous in a specific intellectual way that the show hadn't really done before. Dinklage is predictably excellent. There's a quality he brings, a kind of contained electricity, warmth turned sideways into something threatening. That fits Prater perfectly. The character could have been cartoonish and wasn't. Prater's bodyguard is Charlie, played by Uma Thurman. Charlie is harder to read. She's formidable. She's clearly operating according to her own logic, and the show lets her remain somewhat opaque throughout the season in ways that felt intentional rather than half-finished. More on her later, because the question of where Charlie is now is one of the genuinely interesting threads for season 2. On the law enforcement side, the season introduces Detective Claudia Wallace. Detective Claudette Wallace is the lead detective on a cold case called the New York Ripper, a killer who operated in the city years earlier, mutilating victims in a specific way, then seemingly stopped. Wallace's entire professional identity is built around this case. It is her white whale in the most literal sense. She became a detective partly because of it. And the Ripper has been dormant long enough that most of her colleagues have moved on, but Wallace hasn't. She's still circling. And then Dexter Morgan turns up in her city, and she starts circling him too. Her partner is Detective Melvin Oliva, who has a slightly more grounded, case-focused approach to the job and functions as a useful counterweight to Wallace's obsession. Harrison's arc in season 1 is complicated in the specific way that this show does best. He becomes a suspect in the death of a man named Ryan Foster. Dexter, in a move that tells you everything you need to know about his particular version of fatherhood, chooses to frame another character, a woman called Mia, who the show establishes as genuinely dangerous, for a crime connected to Harrison's situation. It's a morally queasy choice. Dexter is not protecting Harrison out of pure love in that moment. He's also protecting himself, protecting the version of Harrison he wants to exist, and bending his own code in ways that the show is fairly honest about. Mia turns up dead in her jail cell, apparently by her own hand. The circumstances around that are left somewhat ambiguous. The season finale takes place partly at a black tie gala that Prater is hosting, themed around raising money for local police. Dexter ends up locked in a vault beneath the event, surrounded by Prater's files on real murderers. Prater intends for him to stay there. Harrison, in what is both a practical rescue and a quiet statement about their relationship, breaks into the party, figures out the vault code, which is connected to the killer of Prater's parents, a detail that tells you a lot about how Prater's mind worked, and gets Dexter out. Dexter kills Prater. He also walks out of that vault with the files. Every killer Prater had been cataloging, every active murderer he'd been following. Dexter now has that list, and he's clearly not going to leave it alone. The season ends with Harrison making an unexpected decision. He wants to become a cop. The irony of that is not lost on the show, and it's not played for laughs. It's played as the genuinely complex, slightly anguished thing that it is. A boy who was born in blood, raised by a serial killer's adopted sister, shot his own father in the snow, and has had at least one violent incident that required covering up. And he wants to join the police. There's something in that choice that could mean several very different things, and the show is smart enough to let it sit there without immediately explaining it. Angel Batistu gets a proper send-off. David Zayas brought the character back from the original series and gave him a grace note that felt earned. Well, I won't go into specific details, but it's one of the quieter emotional moments of the season, and it works. The final tease of the season is the New York Ripper. Detective Wallace, going through Prater's files, finds a name, Don Frampt. The Ripper's real name, a cold case, suddenly warmer. And on that note, the season ends, which is where we begin. The New York Ripper wasn't invented for the finale. That's worth saying clearly, because sometimes these kinds of reveals, the cold case that suddenly becomes relevant, are retroactively seeded in ways that feel manufactured. But the Ripper runs through season 1 as a genuine thread. Detective Wallace mentions him early. She's been on this case for years. The Ripper's the reason she became who she is professionally, and the show gives that obsession real weight rather than using it as a plot device that only matters at the end. So who is he? The MO is specific. The Ripper mutilated victims using a hooked rod, a distinctive choice that isn't just violent but demonstrative. It says something. It communicates an aesthetic, a satisfaction in a particular kind of physical act that goes beyond what most killers in Dexter's universe are interested in. Most of the franchise's antagonists have been driven by compulsion, by ritual, by a need to impose order or meaning on something inside themselves. The Ripper's method suggests something different. There's a cruelty in the choice of instrument that isn't really about catharsis. It's about causing a particular kind of suffering. And then he stopped. That retirement is one of the most interesting things about the character. He didn't get caught. He didn't die, at least not as far as anyone knows. He just stopped killing, or stopped leaving bodies, which isn't quite the same thing, and switched to something else entirely. Taunting, sending voicemails to victims' families and to the police. Still engaged, still present in the emotional ecosystem of the case, but no longer physically active in the same way. There's something distinctly unsettling about a killer who enjoys the aftermath as much as the act. Most of the Dexter franchise's best antagonists were present tense threats. They were active, they were escalating, they required stopping now. The Ripper is a different kind of problem. He's an old wound that never healed, and he apparently knows it, and apparently gets something from that knowledge. The name Don Frampt surfaces in Prater's files. Wallace finds it in the season 1 finale. It's the real name, or at least the name Prater had, behind the Ripper. And when showrunner Clyde Phillips was pressed on this during a November 2025 episode of the Dark Passengers podcast, his response was characteristically careful. He didn't confirm the character in any specific way. What he said was essentially, the internet went crazy over Don Frampt, and it prompted the writers to think more about the character, and he will be in the second season. That's a non-confirmation that confirms quite a lot. What it tells you is that the Ripper is officially in play for season 2, that his presence was at least partly shaped by audience response, and that the showrunner is being deliberately evasive about how central he'll be. Whether Don Frampt is a primary antagonist or a secondary thread, whether he makes it to Dexter's kill table, ends up in a courtroom, or functions as more of a background menace, that remains genuinely open. There's also the question of whether Don Frampt is even a real name. Prater had access to extraordinary information, but he was also a man with an obsession that could easily distort what he found. Leon Prater believed in serial killers the way some people believe in celebrities, with a reverence that isn't entirely rational. His files were meticulous, but meticulous and accurate aren't the same thing. Fan theories have been circulating since the finale about whether Don Frampt is an alias, a misidentification, or even a deliberate misdirection, whether the Ripper left false tracks for exactly this kind of discovery. One of the more persistent theories in that vein involves Jonah Mitchell, the Tri-Night killer's son. Jonah Mitchell appeared in multiple episodes in the original series. He survived the Trinity season, came back in a later episode, and the show portrayed his psychological state as deeply guilt-ridden and troubled rather than ambiguous. He grew up in Arthur Mitchell's house. He watched what his father did to their family. The idea that Jonah turned out badly is not narratively an enormous stretch, and the timeline could work. He'd be the right age for the Ripper's active period. The theory holds that Don Frampt is either a name Jonah used or a name connected to Jonah's story in some way. I'm not entirely convinced by this one, to be honest. It feels like the kind of theory that fans construct when they want the universe to be tighter and more self-referential than it actually is. Dexter has occasionally done the "it was someone from the past" reveal. The ice truck killer being Dexter's brother was the original, and it remains the most effective version of that move the franchise has ever done. But returning to that well for the Ripper feels like it might close things down rather than open them. The more interesting version of Don Frampt is probably someone new. What we do know now is who's playing him. Brian Cox is playing the New York Ripper. That casting was confirmed ahead of production beginning in April 2026, and the reaction online was fairly immediate and fairly enthusiastic, which makes sense because it's a genuinely good piece of casting for a very specific reason. Cox brings a quality that you can't really manufacture. He's played powerful, calculating, contained men with enormous presence for decades. And there's something in the combination of his age and his particular kind of authority that fits what we know about Don Frampt almost exactly. The Ripper is a retired killer, not a repentant one. There's no sign anywhere in what the show has established that Don Frampt feels bad about what he did. He's retired in the sense that an old criminal might retire, not because the impulse went away, but because something about the calculus changed. Age, injury, a shift in what satisfied him, a risk assessment that no longer favored active killing. We don't know yet. What we know is that he didn't stop engaging. The voicemails to victims' families, the taunting of detectives, the keeping of the emotional wound alive in the people he hurt. That continued. It's almost more disturbing than the killings themselves in a way. The act of murder, however terrible, has a kind of finality. The taunting is just endless. Cox can play that. He can play the man who has more fun watching other people carry the weight of what he did than he ever had doing it. There's a cold amusement in some of his performances. Succession, obviously, is the one everyone reaches for. But look at him in older work too, in things like Adaptation or The Bourne Supremacy. A quality of enjoying himself at other people's expense that never tips into pantomime. That's a hard thing to do. A lot of actors playing villains either go too big or too flat. Cox tends to find a register that's genuinely unsettling precisely because it's so comfortable. The comparison to John Lithgow's Trinity Killer is the one that comes up most often, and it's worth thinking about where that comparison lands and where it doesn't. Trinity was the high point of the original run. Most people agree on that. Lithgow played Arthur Mitchell as a tortured soul in the truest sense, a man who had been shaped by childhood trauma into something monstrous, who hated what he was and couldn't stop being it, who maintained a perfect family life as both a disguise and a genuine aspiration that he repeatedly destroyed from the inside. The horror of Trinity was partly that he was comprehensible. You could follow the thread from the boy who watched his sister die to the man who staged his kills as a ritual reenactment of that loss. It didn't make him forgivable, it made him tragic, and tragic villains tend to linger. Don Frampt sounds like he might be something different. Everything the show has established about the Ripper, the method, the retirement, the ongoing taunting, points toward a sadist rather than a man in pain. Not someone driven by compulsion formed in childhood trauma, but someone who found something in causing suffering that he genuinely liked and pursued deliberately. That's a harder character to make sympathetic, but it's potentially a more frightening one because there's no wound to locate, no origin you can trace back to explain it. Some people are simply oriented toward cruelty. That's an uncomfortable thing to look at directly. Cox is 80 now. The Ripper is old. The Ripper has been sitting with what he did for decades, watching the cold case files gather dust, sending his voicemails into the silence. The story of bringing an old man who did terrible things and who feels absolutely fine about it to any kind of reckoning is not a Dexter story the franchise has told before. That novelty is worth something. One small thing I find interesting in the casting, bringing in Brian Cox puts two genuinely iconic television presences in the same universe. Michael C. Hall spent 18 years building Dexter Morgan into something specific and real. Cox spent 4 seasons building Logan Roy into something that redefined what a television patriarch could be. The collision of those two energies, even in a totally different context, is inherently interesting to watch. That's not a theory about the plot, it's just a thing I'm looking forward to. There's a second confirmed villain for season 2, and he's being played by Dan Stevens, an actor who is, in my opinion, chronically underused in American television despite being quite good at this specific register of charming with something wrong underneath. The character is called the Five Borough Killer. The name is geographic. It maps onto Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, the 5 boroughs of New York City, which tells you a few things immediately. This is someone who doesn't have a fixed hunting ground, which suggests mobility, which suggests either professional cover for that movement, financial resources, or both. It also suggests a certain kind of pride in the scope of the operation. Calling yourself the Five Borough Killer is not a name assigned by a detective. It's either a media creation that the killer found flattering and kept, or it's the kind of thing Prater would have written in his files with something approaching admiration. The theory that most fans seem to land on, and I think it's the right read, is that the Five Borough Killer is on Prater's list. Dexter walked out of that vault with documentation on multiple active killers. The Ripper and the Five Borough Killer are almost certainly 2 different entries on that list, 2 different threads running simultaneously through the season. The Ripper is the central antagonist, the cold case that Wallace has been carrying for years. The Five Borough Killer is probably more immediately active. Someone Dexter can move toward with purpose, while the larger Ripper story develops more slowly. Dan Stevens is interesting casting for that role specifically because he carries a kind of surface warmth that can flip. There's something in his face that's genuinely likable. And then there are moments where you catch something else underneath it that doesn't quite match. He's done it in very different contexts over the years, and the effect is consistent. You trust him slightly more than you should for slightly longer than is comfortable. That's a useful quality in a Dexter villain, where the show has traditionally been good at keeping its antagonists in a gray zone before they become clearly and unambiguously dangerous. One theory that's been floating around since the casting announcement is that the Five Borough Killer and the Ripper aren't unconnected. The idea, when it's in Arcania Voronio, and it's speculative, there's no confirmation either way, is that Don Frampt was a kind of mentor figure, or at least an influence on the Five Borough Killer. That the Ripper, in his retirement, found a different kind of satisfaction in watching someone else carry the work. That the voicemails and the taunting were never quite enough, and at some point the Ripper found a successor. That would give the season a structure where Dexter is dealing with an active threat in real time while also closing in on the origin of that threat. The old man who, in some sense, made the current problem possible. It would also give Detective Wallace a more complicated case to work than a simple cold case goes warm story. If Don Frampt is connected to recent active kills through the Five Borough Killer, the cold case and the active investigation aren't separate things. They're the same thing. I find that version of the story more interesting than either killer operating in isolation. But I'm genuinely uncertain about it, and the show hasn't said anything definitive. Consider that a working theory, not a given. Here's a fun detail that I think deserves its own moment. In Season 1, Dexter had a man on his kill table, and the man did not get away. Al Walker, nicknamed Rapunzel by fans, and I believe by the show itself in reference to the long hair he apparently used to lure victims in, was played by Eric Stonestreet, who is primarily known for Modern Family and who is, based on what Season 1 showed, quite capable of playing something entirely different. Walker is dangerous, Walker has done terrible things, Walker is exactly the kind of person Dexter's code exists to address. And Walker walked out of that kill room. That almost never happens in Dexter. The kill room, once someone is on the table, is essentially the end of the road. It's the point of no return in both directions. Dexter commits fully to the act. The act completes. The body ends up in the water or equivalent. The few times the sequence has broken down across the franchise's history, and there have been a handful, it has almost always resulted in complications that follow Dexter for episodes or seasons afterward. It's not something the show does accidentally. When someone escapes, it means something. The fan consensus on Walker for season 2 is basically unanimous. He's the first kill. He's the unfinished business that Dexter would not, under any reading of the character, leave unaddressed. He has information, he's a loose end. He's a person who has seen Dexter Morgan in a context that removes all ambiguity about what Dexter is. You don't leave that person alive and just hope for the best. Whether Stone Street actually returns to film new scenes, or whether the resolution happens in some other way, a reported death, an off-screen implication, is less certain. It's possible the show handles Walker's story fairly quickly in the first episode or two, as a kind of ceremonial clearing of the decks before the main season's threads take hold. That would fit structurally, get the housekeeping done early, establish that Dexter is operating again with purpose, and then let the Ripper and the 5-borough killer and everything else unfold. There's also a smaller theory, more of a footnote than a proper theory, that Walker doesn't just get caught by Dexter, but ends up somehow entangled in the Wallace investigation in a way that creates a problem. If Walker has been talking to people, if he's been trying to tell someone what he saw in that room without being able to explain the full context, that's a thread that could complicate things. Probably not the main point of his return. But worth noting, Harrison deciding to become a police officer is, depending on your angle, either the most logical thing in the world or the most deeply ironic, probably both simultaneously, which is why the show keeps letting it breathe rather than rushing to editorialize. Think about the genealogy of the decision for a moment. Harry Morgan was a cop, a genuinely dedicated one, complicated in his own ways, but someone who built his entire identity around law enforcement and the idea of justice. Harry took a traumatized child and, rather than getting him help, made him useful, shaped him into something that could operate inside Harry's own framework of what justice meant. Dexter became what he became partly because Harry needed him to. The code was partly for Dexter's sake and partly for Harry's. That's worth sitting with. And now Harrison, the son of the monster that Harry's experiment eventually produced, is choosing to become a cop. The show confirmed ahead of season 2 that Harrison will have a new love interest, the daughter of Captain Mixon, who runs an NYPD homicide squad. Bokeem Woodbine is playing Mixon, and the captain's daughter is reportedly a young detective on his team. The dramatic irony built into that relationship from its very inception is almost too neat to be accidental. Harrison Morgan, who has witnessed things most detectives will never see, who has blood on his hands in ways that exist in a moral gray zone, who is the son of the most prolific vigilante killer in American fictional history, is going to be in a relationship with a cop whose father runs the kind of squad that would put Dexter Morgan away forever if they ever found out who he was. That's an extremely fraught social situation, which again is probably deliberate. The question of what Harrison's cop career means depends on what the show intends to do with his psychology. There are really 3 possible reads, and they point in very different directions. The first read, Harrison becoming a cop, is a genuine attempt to build something constructive out of the wreckage of his life. He's been through an extraordinary amount by any measure. He grew up without his father, in the care of people who were trying to manage grief and instability, until he eventually decided to find Dexter himself. He watched Dexter kill. He killed himself in at least one confirmed situation. He He shot his own father in the snow. The decision to become a police officer could be his version of the code, a channel for the darkness that doesn't require him to become what his father was. That's the hopeful reading. The second read, Harrison's choice is a form of self-punishment or control, not hope, but discipline. The idea that if he puts himself inside a structure with clear rules and clear authority, he can prevent himself from becoming dangerous. The cop career as a kind of leash. This version of Harrison is aware of what he might be capable of and is scared of it, and the badge is his best argument to himself that he won't go there. The third read, Harrison is exactly like his father in every way that matters, and the cop career is just the most efficient cover he could have found. Harry was a cop who created a serial killer. Harrison could be a cop who becomes one. And the girlfriend who is literally the daughter of his precinct captain is the most spectacular possible complication to that trajectory. I don't think the show is going to confirm the third reading, at least not in season 2. But I do think it's the reading the show wants you to be able to see from the corner of your eye. The best version of Harrison's arc keeps all three possibilities simultaneously open for as long as possible before committing to one. Something else worth noting, Harrison's girlfriend Gigi has been discussed in fan theory circles for a while now in a slightly different context. There's a theory, which we'll come back to when we talk about who might discover Dexter's secret, that it won't be a detective who figures out what Dexter is this season. It'll be someone in Harrison's immediate social orbit, and the girlfriend who happens to be a cop with a father who runs homicide is a very specific combination of proximity and professional capability. The phrase "born in blood" gets used in this franchise with some frequency, but it has a specific and literal meaning when applied to Harrison. He was found as an infant sitting in a pool of his mother's blood after Arthur Mitchell killed her. His first coherent memory is probably something that most adults never experience and couldn't process. Whatever else Harrison Morgan is, he came into consciousness already inside a crime scene. The show has been dancing around the question of whether Harrison has what Dexter had. Some internal pressure toward violence, some orientation that isn't just anger or trauma, but something more specific and directed, since New Blood. The straight razor he was keeping in a flashlight, the way he hurt Ethan, the incident with Ryan Foster that required Dexter's intervention in season 1, none of this is conclusive. It adds up to a pattern, but patterns in fiction can be red herrings. The show knows we're watching for the dark passenger in Harrison. It might be giving it to us, or it might be deliberately running that reading up to see how far we'll follow before it turns. Here's the thing about the dark passenger that the original show eventually said quite plainly. It's not real. It's a framework Dexter built to manage his relationship with himself. Harry's vision in one of the later seasons spells this out. The dark passenger is no more real than I am, he says, which is a remarkably bleak thing for a hallucination to tell you. What it means is that Dexter's violence was never something visiting him from outside. It was always his. He was always responsible. The concept was a way of avoiding that responsibility, of keeping a safe distance between Dexter the person and Dexter the killer. If Harrison has the same capacity for violence, and the evidence suggests he at least has some version of it, the interesting question isn't whether he has a dark passenger, it's whether he'll build one. Whether he'll construct the same psychological scaffolding that let his father function, the same convenient distance between the person and the act. Or whether he'll do something the original series never really did, which is acknowledge the capacity fully and refuse to dress it up. The cop career is relevant here in a very specific way. If Harrison is building toward killing, not impulsively, not in self-defense, but with the deliberateness that defines Dexter's kills, the cop career gives him the same access to information and cases and potential targets that Dexter's forensics work gave him. The show might be setting up a situation where, by the end of the 3-season run, Harrison is functionally what Dexter was. Not a repeat of the same character, but a new iteration of the same pattern, which would be either tragic or cyclical or both. depending on how you look at it. The fan theory that gets traction in this space is this: Harrison kills someone in season 2. Not accidentally, not in a panic, but in a way that is deliberate enough to require a decision. And the person he kills is someone who deserves it. Someone who fits a code, even if that code hasn't been articulated yet. The kill is clean in a moral sense, messy in every other sense, and it forces Harrison to stop pretending the question is still open. He knows what he is after that. What he does with that knowledge is the rest of the story. There's a version of this that connects to the girlfriend, Captain Mixon's daughter. If Harrison kills someone and she's close enough to the case to realize what happened, or to at least suspect it, the season 2 finale has its emotional climax built in. Not Dexter being caught, but Harrison being seen clearly by someone who loves him and also has a professional obligation to the truth. That's a very good television story. I hope they're writing it. Blessing Kamara is Dexter's landlord in New York. He's a presence in season 1 without being a major plot driver. He exists in Dexter's domestic life, in the texture of his new city, in a way that felt slightly underwritten at the time, but more deliberately placed in retrospect. The show gives him a history. He has a dark past, he says, something he describes as a darkness he overcame, with help from his mother, Prudence. That's the specific detail. The mother's name is Prudence. She helped him through whatever it was, and we haven't met her. The internet immediately decided Blessing is the New York Ripper. I understand the instinct. The show plants that kind of detail, the dark past, the overcome violence, the specific mention of a parent figure who intervened, and trained Dexter viewers read it as a flag. We've been watching this franchise for long enough to know that when someone near Dexter mentions violence in their background, it tends to be relevant. That's not paranoia, that's pattern recognition. Here's where I get stuck on the Ripper version of this theory. Don Frampt has been confirmed as a separate character played by Brian Cox. For Blessing to be the Ripper, the show would have to be doing one of the following, revealing that Don Frampt is an alias Blessing used, revealing that Cox is playing a completely different person than Frampt, or revealing that Prater's information about the Ripper's identity was simply wrong. None of those are impossible. The alias option is the most plausible. Don Frampt doesn't sound like a real name. It sounds like the kind of pseudonym a careful killer might use, and Blessing Kamara is the kind of name someone might have been born with before a life change. But it requires the show to have planted the name as a deliberate misdirection, which feels like a fairly big structural gamble. My read, and this is where I end up after turning it over, is that Blessing is not the Ripper, but Blessing is probably something. The specific phrasing about his past, the mother named Prudence who helped him, the proximity to Dexter, these details don't feel decorative, they feel like setup. The more likely version is that Blessing is a killer of some kind, distinct from the Ripper and the 5 Borough Killer, possibly on Prater's list, or possibly someone who operates below that level of notoriety, someone who did terrible things, was caught or stopped or chose to stop, and has been living quietly ever since in a way that parallels Dexter's own attempts at a normal life. If that's right, the dynamic between Dexter and Blessing in season 2 becomes one of mutual recognition. 2 people who know what they are, circling each other in a domestic setting, neither entirely sure what the other will do with the information. That's a genuinely interesting social horror scenario. The people you're most afraid of are the ones who know your specific kind of wrong. There's a secondary theory that gets discussed alongside the Blessing is killer version, which is that Blessing discovers Dexter's secret. Not necessarily because Blessing is a killer himself, but simply because he lives close enough and pays enough attention. The landlord who figures it out. The ordinary man who is just observant enough in the right moment at the wrong time. That's a pressure point the show hasn't really used in quite that form before. Detective Claudia Wallace is, in some ways, the most structurally interesting addition to the franchise in years. She functions as the laguertu role, the investigator who gets close, who is good enough at her job to sense something that she can't quite prove. but she comes with her own specific emotional architecture that makes her distinct. LaGuertu's investigation into Dexter in the original series was driven partly by professional instinct and partly by loyalty to Dokes, a colleague she believed had been wrongly framed. It was personal, but not in a way that compromised her as an investigator. She was thorough and she was right, and the show had to kill her to prevent her from succeeding. Wallace's obsession has a different texture. It began with the Ripper cold case years before Dexter arrived in New York. She built a career on that obsession, and now, in season 1, she has something she didn't have before. A name in a file, Don Frempt, sourced from the records of a dead billionaire who had been cataloging serial killers for years. That's a significant jump forward on a case she's been running for much of her professional life. The question for season 2 is how that cold case investigation intersects with Wallace's growing awareness of Dexter Morgan. She was already suspicious in season 1. She was circling him in the way that good detectives circle people they can't quite place yet. With Leon Prater dead and Dexter apparently cleared of involvement in anything specifically provable, Wallace has less of a hook on him heading into the new season, but she's also a better detective than the hook requires. She'll find her way back. Some reports have suggested that Joe E. Quinn, from the original series, who knew Angel Bautista well, may take up the work that Bautista was doing in Resurrection before his death, looking into Dexter with the specific kind of concern of someone who is not pursuing a case but pursuing a feeling. That dynamic, if it develops, puts two threads closing in simultaneously. Wallace with her professional apparatus and institutional resources, and Quinn with personal motivation and the kind of knowledge that only comes from having been in this universe for years. Quinn knowing what he knows, caring what he cares about, and having watched Bautista go to New York to look at Dexter and not come back. That's a particular kind of fuel. The show has always been at its best when the person getting close is someone with an emotional stake, not just a procedural one. Oliva tends to be the anchor in this pairing, the more grounded, case-focused detective who balances Wallace's single-mindedness. He'll likely continue in that role, which probably means he's more likely to be the one who notices something wrong at a practical level while Wallace is pursuing the larger picture. A useful dynamic and one the show has used in slightly different forms before. Charlie survived season 1. That's the notable thing, given how many people around Leon Prater did not. Uma Thurman played her with a kind of coiled stillness that was genuinely effective. Not the most voluble character in the season, but very present. Charlie was Prater's bodyguard, which told you something about her capabilities. She was loyal to Prater, which told you something about her orientation. And she was aware, clearly, of what Prater was doing and who he was. She couldn't have been that close to his operation for that long and remained ignorant of its nature. So Charlie is alive. She knows what Dexter is. She was loyal to a man Dexter killed. And her contractual status for season 2 is, as of the last confirmed information, undetermined. That combination of facts generates 3 reasonably distinct possibilities for how the show handles her. The first, Charlie becomes an adversary. She has motive now. Her employer's dead, she knows who did it, and whatever else she felt about Prater, loyalty doesn't tend to just expire. If Charlie spent years in Prater's employ and believed in him, or if she simply operates on a professional ethics of loyalty until completion, then Dexter's existence is an active problem for her. This version of Charlie is probably the most naturally dramatic choice, and it creates a threat that operates differently from the Ripper or the 5-borough killer because it's personal in a way those aren't. The second, Charlie becomes something closer to an ally, or at least a neutral party. This requires the show to establish that Charlie's loyalty to Prater had limits, or that her assessment of Dexter after season 1 landed somewhere other than pure enmity. It's not the obvious read, but the show has done unlikely alignments before. Lumen in season 5 is the model for the person who should be Dexter's enemy and become something more complicated. Charlie has enough complexity in her establishment as a character that this version is at least structurally possible. The third possibility, and the one that might actually explain the contractual ambiguity, Charlie doesn't return in a significant way in Season 2. She's alive, the show has that option available, but the season's priorities are the Ripper and Harrison and the 5-borough killer. Charlie comes back in Season 3 as a long-game threat. The show holds her. Of the three, I find myself most drawn to the first, but most believing the third. The Ripper and the new cast around him is enough for one season. Charlie feels like she was written to come back with weight, not as a subplot. Harry Morgan has been dead for most of this franchise's life. He died before the original series began, of a broken heart, essentially, after discovering what Dexter had become, what the code had made. In the show's logic, the version of Harry we've watched across 8 seasons of the original series, across A New Blood, and now into Resurrection is not the real, living Harry. It's Dexter's internalized version of him. A construction. A voice he gave his father's face, because having that voice come from his own mouth would have been too honest. James Remar plays him and has done for a very long time. And there's something quietly remarkable about an actor spending this many years playing a character who is essentially one person's psychological defense mechanism rendered in human form. Remar brings a warmth to it that is genuinely affecting, even when Harry is being difficult, even when the Vision is telling Dexter things he doesn't want to hear. There's a care in how Remar plays it that keeps the construction sympathetic. In Resurrection Season 1, Harry appears as a spectral projection. The same function, continued, updated to the New York setting. He's Dexter's conscience, his sounding board, the voice of the code in a setting where the code keeps having to be renegotiated because circumstances keep changing. Here's the thing that I think is genuinely interesting about where Harry goes in Season 2, and it's something I haven't seen discussed much. The original series spent years exploring what Harry meant to Dexter as a father figure, as the architect of the code, as the person who made Dexter what he was. That's the relationship the franchise has always leaned into, Harry and Dexter, the absent father and the damaged child. But now Harrison is in the story, and Harrison is the actual child in need of a father, an actual present tense son who has a functioning relationship with Dexter that is being built in real time. The emotional dynamic that Harry used to occupy, the parent-child structure, the guidance, the "do I deserve to be loved" subtext, is now available through Harrison. In a narrative sense, Harry is somewhat redundant, which means either the show retires him or the show shifts what he represents. One theory that I find myself thinking about: Harry starts appearing to Harrison, not to Dexter or not only to Dexter. The conscience figure passes to the next generation, not literally, but as a thematic statement. Harrison starts reckoning with the Morgan legacy in a way that involves Harry, either through stories Dexter tells him or through Harrison's own visions as the dark impulses clarify. Harry as the grandfather who built the architecture that is now Harrison's inheritance. That would be a significant shift for the character's function. Remar confirmed for Season 2, which tells us Harry isn't being quietly dropped. The question is what he's being kept for. There's also a version of the Harry thread that goes more directly inward for Dexter himself. Now that the revenge of New Blood and the reconciliation with Harrison are both complete, what is the code actually for? Dexter has operated under Harry's framework his entire life. But the framework was designed for a specific context. Miami, a specific understanding of what justice meant. A specific set of constraints. In New York, older, with a son who is now building something of his own, does Dexter still need the code in the same form? Does Harry still need to exist? The idea that Dexter might stop hearing Harry's voice, not because Harry is exorcised dramatically, but because Dexter gradually stops needing him, would be one of the quieter and more interesting psychological evolutions the show could do. a man outgrowing the version of his father that he invented to survive. The files are the engine of this franchise now, at least for the next season or two. That's worth sitting with because it represents a genuinely structural shift in how the show generates Dexter's targets. In the original series, Dexter found people the way a predator finds prey. Through his work at Miami Metro, through police databases he had access to, through a kind of territorial attunement to the city he'd operated in for years. The process was organic, case by case, target by target. He was always responding to something. The code said he could only kill murderers who had escaped the system, and the system kept providing candidates. Prater's files change that. They're not a single case or a single thread. They're a curated archive, a billionaire's life work in tracking the worst people in the country, annotated with details that law enforcement either didn't have or couldn't legally use. Dexter walked out of that vault with a list, a long one, and the implication is clear. He has work to do, and he knows exactly where to start. That's a very different operating mode. It makes Dexter more deliberate, more strategic, and potentially more interesting to watch because he's not just reacting to circumstances. He's making choices about priority and sequence. Who first? Who's most dangerous? Who's hardest to reach? These are questions that push the show in a slightly thriller-adjacent direction. The 5-borough killer is almost certainly on the list. Al Walker is almost certainly on the list. The Ripper. Well, the Ripper is complicated because the Ripper is retired, and retired might mean protected in ways that active killers aren't. Getting to Don Frampt is probably not a simple matter of finding him and setting up a kill room. A man who has evaded capture and stopped killing and been taunting detectives for years has thought about his own exposure in ways that a lot of Dexter's easier targets haven't. There's a theory that goes beyond the immediate Season 2 scope, which holds that the files are the architecture for the whole remaining run of the show. 3 seasons planned. Season 2 works through some of the list, the Ripper, the 5-borough killer, Walker, and introduces the complications that make straightforward list clearing impossible. Season 3 is where the list collides with everything else. Harrison, Wallace, whatever Charlie is doing. The question of whether Dexter can exist indefinitely in this mode without something giving way. The files provide structure. The structure creates the shape of an ending. There's also the question of whether anyone else knows the files exist. Prater was connected. He had a network around his obsession. If that network includes people who knew what Prater kept in the vault and who know that Dexter walked out with it, then the files are a liability as well as an asset. People who want that information back. People who had arrangements with some of the names on that list. Arrangements that don't benefit from sudden Dexter-mediated scrutiny. That's probably Season 3 territory rather than Season 2, if it happens at all. But it's a logical implication of the setup that I don't think the show will ignore forever. 3 seasons planned. That's the stated intent from the people making the show. 3 seasons with possibility for more, which is the kind of hedge that all television productions build in, but the underlying architecture is 3. And 3 is a specific number. 3 has a shape. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which sounds obvious, but actually isn't what most long-running television promises. Most long-running television promises more television for as long as the audience will watch. A planned 3-season arc is a different kind of commitment. It means somebody in the room has thought about what the conclusion looks like. So what does it look like? The show has given us several ingredients that feel like they're being measured for something. Dexter alive and operating, Harrison choosing law enforcement, the files as a structural engine, the Ripper as a central antagonist for Season 2, the confirmed 3-season plan, pointing toward an endpoint that Clyde Phillips and his team have at least an outline already written toward. Let me work through the theories about the endgame one at a time in the order I find them most interesting rather than most probable. The rehabilitation theory first because it's the one nobody would predict, and therefore the one I find most compelling as a pure storytelling choice. What if the endgame is that Dexter stops, not because he's caught, not because he dies, but because the thing that drove the killing, the compulsion, the code, the dark passenger, gradually loses its grip over the course of 3 seasons as his relationship with Harrison gives him something that matters more than the urge. Dexter has been described in the original series and its sequels as someone who doesn't understand love fully, who approximates it through code and caretaking and protection. Harrison is the first person in a very long time who has made Dexter's love feel reciprocal and real. What if that changes the equation? What if the show's actual ending is not a body in the water, but a man who found something worth being alive for? I don't think this is the most likely ending, but I think it's the most earned one if they write it carefully, and it would be the ending that the franchise has arguably been building towards since season 4 when Rita died, and Harrison was first found in that bathtub. The whole question was always whether Dexter could become a real father. New Blood said no, spectacularly. Resurrection said maybe, quietly. Season 3 could say yes, finally. The Harrison-centric endgame theory is the second one. This version holds that the show is transitioning focus over 3 seasons so that when it ends, it's essentially a handoff. Dexter's story concludes, possibly in the way that many people expected New Blood to end, a real final death, and Harrison continues. Harrison as a cop who also kills. Harrison running a version of the code that is his own rather than inherited. The franchise has enough goodwill now to sustain a Harrison spin-off if that's where they want to go, and this 3-season run is the setup. It's the origin story told forward rather than backward. The original Sin Theory version, this is the bleakest one, so I'm putting it last and moving past it quickly, says that the end game is about the cycle being unbreakable. Dexter gets caught or dies, and Harrison is already far enough down his own path that it doesn't matter. The code was always a delay mechanism, not a cure. The franchise ends acknowledging that some things don't change, no matter how much you want them to. I prefer not to believe that one, to be honest. Not because I need television to be optimistic, it doesn't need to be, but because the show has already given us the bleak version of this story in the original series finale and in parts of New Blood. Doing it again would be repetition rather than conclusion. The version I find most structurally satisfying, if I'm honest, is a hybrid of the first 2. Dexter's story ends with some form of genuine resolution. Maybe he's caught, maybe he chooses to stop. Maybe he makes a sacrifice that means something rather than just a defeat. And Harrison's story continues, not as a serial killer, but as someone who had the choice and made a different one. The cycle breaks, not because it was inevitable, but because someone, for the first time in this franchise's history, chose to break it. That's actually a hopeful thing for a show that has been dark for 20 years. And I think after everything this franchise has put its characters and its audience through, hopeful might be what's earned. There are also some smaller threads that feed into the endgame picture that I should mention, because they'll matter to the shape of individual seasons, even if they aren't the final note. The Trinity Killer prequel series. An unnamed spin-off has been announced that will focus on Arthur Mitchell's early life and first kills in the 1970s. The fact that the franchise is expanding in that direction tells you something about how Paramount and Showtime see the Dexter brand's long-term value. If Resurrection ends and the Trinity prequel is already running, the universe continues regardless, which takes some pressure off Resurrection itself to be a definitive ending. It's a chapter in an ongoing mythology, not the last page. That's a different kind of storytelling responsibility, and the show might lean into that rather than resist it. John Lithgow's guest appearance in Resurrection Season 1, a brief one from what was reported, is a small data point about how the show is relating to its own history. Trinity is dead. Harrison was traumatized in Trinity's shadow. The cameo, if it happened the way it was described, was probably more thematic than plot functional. A ghost in the room, the original sin of the whole story. Season 2 probably won't repeat that, but it tells you the show is interested in the complete picture of this universe and is willing to call back to its own mythology when it serves something real. And that's most of it, really. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. The Ripper, Brian Cox, Dan Stevens, and the Five-Borough Killer, Al Walker and his inconvenient escape, Harrison deciding he wants a badge, the dark passenger question, and what it means now that there are two Morgans in the story to ask it about, Blessing and the landlord theory, Wallace and Oliva and the cold case warming back up, Charlie's uncertain future, the ghost of Harry Morgan and what it's actually doing in the story at this point, the files from the vault, and where 3 planned seasons might be heading. It's a lot of threads, more than the original series usually had running simultaneously actually. Resurrection Season 1 established that the show is comfortable with that kind of density, and Season 2 seems to be leaning further into it rather than simplifying, which is either exciting or slightly daunting, depending on how you feel about Dexter's track record of landing complicated multi-thread seasons cleanly. I do think Resurrection has earned some good faith on that front. The critical response to Season 1 was genuinely strong. A 95% score is not what anyone expected in 2025 for a Dexter season, and it reflects something real about what Clyde Phillips and the team did. They took a franchise that was genuinely on the floor and made something that remembered why people cared in the first place. Season 2 has good ingredients. Brian Cox is a genuinely exciting piece of casting. The Harrison arc has real stakes now that he's made a concrete choice about his future. The files give Dexter purpose. The Wallace investigation gives the season its ticking clock element. October 2026 is the target window, which means we're probably about a year away as things stand. I'll have more videos on the Dexter franchise in the coming weeks. There's a whole retrospective on the original series I've been wanting to do for a while, and I want to spend some time with Original Sin before its cancellation gets completely buried by the Resurrection news. There's a lot there worth talking about. But for tonight, that's everything. I hope it was a good way to spend a few hours. Sleep well. There are a few things about Resurrection Season 1 that I didn't linger on in the recap that feel worth sitting with, partly because they feed into the theories for Season 2, and partly because they're just genuinely interesting pieces of the season's construction. The question of how Dexter rebuilt himself after the gunshot is one of those things. He woke up in an emergency room in a town that wasn't Iron Lake, receiving care from people who had no reason to know who he was, with a son who had pulled the trigger and left. The gap between that moment and the New York arrival isn't fully dramatized in Season 1. We get pieces of it, context here and there. But what the show establishes is that the recovery was both physical and something else. Dexter didn't emerge from that hospital the same person who went in, and not only because his body needed time, something shifted in the reckoning. The person who made the choice to walk away from Harrison one more time in the New Blood finale, the person who told his son to shoot and meant it, came out of that hospital with a different relationship to what it meant to survive. That's not a small thing. The original series, Dexter, was largely motivated by impulse and code in roughly equal measure. The urge required expression. The code regulated how. New Blood Dexter was motivated by suppression and the eventual failure of it. Resurrection. Dexter, at least in Season 1, seems motivated by something more fragile and more interesting. A genuine desire to be present for a son who has every reason to want nothing to do with him. That's not the same as Love Redeemed, and the show is careful not to oversell it. But it's a different kind of driver than the franchise has used before, and it gives Dexter a vulnerability that the original series mostly kept at arm's length. Neil Patrick Harris had a guest role in Season 1, and it was widely discussed before the season aired because the casting was so conspicuously against type. I won't go into specific episode details here, but the general shape of it, a performance that leaned into the dissonance between his public persona and whatever the character required, was effective in the way that precisely calibrated casting decisions usually are. The show has always been good at using guest stars not just for plot, but for tonal punctuation. John Lithgow's cameo was another moment like that. Trinity appearing in Resurrection, even briefly, even in a context that was more symbolic than functional, was a reminder of how much that season meant to the show's best period, and it was clearly placed with intention. Harrison was already born when Rita was killed by Arthur Mitchell. Arthur Mitchell's presence, even ghostly, is the origin of everything Harrison carries. Having Lithgow appear in the same narrative space as Jack Alcott's Harrison is a visual statement that the show didn't need to make explicit. The Eric Stonestreet casting as Al Walker was also against expectation in a slightly different register. Stonestreet in comedic roles is warm and present and physically expressive in a way that television comedies live on. As Walker, he was doing something much stiller and more interior. The nickname Rapunzel carried its own dark humor. The fairy tale softness of the name wrapped around a figure who used exactly that softness as a weapon. The casting choice made that irony legible in a way that a different actor might not have. One more thing about season 1 worth noting, which is that the show handled the Harrison as murder suspect plot without making Harrison a hero or a villain. He was in a situation that required Dexter to make choices for him, which is its own kind of comment on what that relationship is. Dexter didn't help Harrison because Harrison is innocent. Harrison is probably not entirely innocent. Dexter helped Harrison because Harrison is his son, and the code, when it meets love, has always bent. The original series illustrated this repeatedly. What's new in Resurrection is that the bending is happening in plain sight of the audience, without Dexter's usual internal monologue performing neutrality. He knows he's compromising, he does it anyway. That's a different Dexter from the one who spent 8 seasons explaining himself to us through his own unreliable narration. Since we're on the topic of Don Frampt and the kind of killer the New York Ripper represents, it's worth spending a bit more time on what the taunting behavior specifically tells us. Because I think it's the most distinctive thing about this character, and it's the thing that sets up the Brian Cox version most clearly. Most serial killers in fiction, and a significant number of real ones, are primarily interested in the act itself. The kill is the event. What comes before is anticipation. What comes after is the residual charge of having done it, but the act is the center of gravity. The Ripper, at least as season 1 establishes him, stopped doing the act. He retired from the act. And he replaced it with something else, staying present in the emotional lives of the people his acts destroyed. That's a specific and unusual orientation. It suggests that for the Ripper, the act was never entirely the point, or rather the act was the point when it was available. But the deeper satisfaction was in the impact, in knowing that people were still living inside what he did, still carrying it, still not over it. The voicemails to victims' families aren't nostalgia, they're maintenance. He's maintaining something, keeping a wound from closing, keeping people connected to the worst moment of their lives because that connection is what he finds nourishing. There's a word for this in clinical literature, just sadism, which can involve psychological as well as purely physical cruelty, though the categories overlap in complex ways. The pleasure is less in the physical act than in the emotional domination it produces and sustains. And that form of sadism doesn't require ongoing physical violence to operate. It operates through memory, through the certainty that no matter how much time passes, the Ripper can pick up the phone and put those families back in the room where everything ended. For a show that has always been thoughtful about the psychology of its villains, that's a rich vein. It creates an antagonist who is dangerous in ways that don't require physical confrontation, at least not initially. The danger is distributed across time, across all the people he's already harmed, across Detective Wallace's entire career. Before Dexter even finds Don Frampt, Frampt has already done most of his damage. The question for season 2 isn't preventing the Ripper's next kill, it might be reckoning with everything he already is. Let me come back to the Jonah Mitchell theory for a moment, because I want to be fair to it, even if I don't ultimately buy it. Jonah was the Tri-Nighty killer's son. He appeared in the original series during a later season, returning to the narrative in a context that was deliberately ambiguous about how he'd processed what happened in his family. He'd watched his father kill, he'd lived in a house built on violence and religious mania. He was, by any reasonable measure, a person with significant, unresolved psychological damage and potentially very specific destructive capacities that he'd been marinated in from childhood. The theory holds that Jonah, after his appearance in the original series, eventually became violent himself. That the damage was too deep, the exposure too formative, and that at some point the thing that had been done to him became the thing he did. The Ripper timeline in this version places Jonah as a young man when the active kills began, which is possible if the Ripper's period of activity was in the late 1990s or 2000s. And Don Frampt would be the name he adopted. What I find genuinely interesting about this theory, even though I don't think it's right, is what it would say thematically. Because if Jonah Mitchell became the New York Ripper, then the Trinity season didn't just cost Dexter Rita, it created a ripple that reached all the way into the Resurrection timeline, a consequence of Arthur Mitchell's violence that metastasized into something new. Dexter's failure to stop Trinity sooner, his hesitation, his fascination, his decision to learn from Trinity rather than simply ending him, directly produced a killer that is now threatening New York decades later. That would be a brutal piece of thematic architecture, the sins of delayed justice, compounding. But again, Brian Cox is playing Don Frampt, and Brian Cox is not Jonah Mitchell. So either the theory is wrong, or the show is doing something significantly more complicated with the name than the straightforward reading suggests. One detail that the fandom has spent some time on: the name Don Frampt itself doesn't feel like a real name in the way most Dexter character names do. It sounds constructed. It has the quality of letters that could be rearranged, or of a phrase that means something in another language, or simply of a fake name that was designed to read as generic enough to pass. Some fans have done anagram analysis on it. I won't go through every variant here. That way lies a kind of obsession that doesn't actually help you sleep. But the consensus seems to be that if it is an anagram, the intended version hasn't been definitively found. It might just be a name, or it might be a thing the writers are very pleased with themselves about and are waiting for someone to catch. Something that the theories tend to skip over, because theories tend to be about revelations and twists rather than process, is the practical question of how Dexter actually closes in on Don Frampt. And this is genuinely interesting because the Ripper is a different kind of target from anything Dexter has hunted before. Think about the typical Dexter target acquisition model. He identifies someone through police work or police databases. He observes them. He establishes guilt beyond his own version of reasonable doubt. He sets up a kill room. The code requires certainty before action, and the certainty requires access to evidence, usually the kind of evidence that flows naturally through his professional life as a forensics analyst. Don Frampt is not that. Don Frampt is a cold case with a name, but presumably no address, no current location, no recent activity that would feed into a standard investigative channel. Prater's file has a name. It probably has more. Prater was obsessive and meticulous, so the file presumably contains everything he was able to find. But a man who has been quiet for decades, who has been careful enough to evade law enforcement for his entire operational period, who stopped killing before DNA databases became what they are. Finding that man requires something different from Dexter's usual approach. The theory that fans keep coming back to is that Dexter's pursuit of the Ripper runs parallel to Wallace's cold case investigation, and that at some point those two threads have to cross. Not necessarily that they cooperate openly. That would be a significant structural shift for the franchise. But that information flows between them in ways that neither fully controls. Wallace finds something that Dexter needs. Dexter knows something that Wallace's official channels can't access. They're both closing in on the same man from different directions. And the question of who gets there first and what each of them does when they arrive is the engine of the season. There's a darker variant of this theory that I think is actually more likely. Dexter doesn't find Frampt by hunting him. Frampt finds Dexter. The Ripper has been watching. That's what he does. He watches and he stays connected and he maintains the emotional reality of his impact. It's not a stretch to imagine that a man like Don Frampt, who's been keeping the flame of his cold case alive for decades, who has been sending voicemails to stay relevant, who derived his deepest satisfaction from being present in his victims' lives long after the fact, would notice a new player entering the field. Leon Prater's death was not quiet. Dexter's arrival in New York was not invisible. If Frampt has any network, any awareness of how the criminal world of the city has shifted, he knows something has happened. And a killer who is primarily interested in psychological impact rather than physical expression would find Dexter Morgan, theoretically, extremely interesting. Not as a target, as a mirror, as a conversation. The most unnerving version of Season 2, and I think the most thematically coherent version, is one where Dexter and the Ripper are drawn toward each other not just by circumstance but by a mutual recognition that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't been where they both are. The Ripper sees Dexter, Dexter sees the Ripper, and the season is as much about what that recognition does to both of them as it is about the procedural question of who ends up on whose table. Brian Cox, playing a character who looks at Michael C., hauls Dexter and says, in some form, "I see you." That's a scene I'd be genuinely curious to watch. There's a version of this discussion that doesn't get into the theories and just looks at the pattern, at what the franchise has done across its history when it has been at its best, and what that suggests about where Season 2's most important moments might live. The original series peaked in Season 4, and the reason Season 4 worked so well isn't really about the Tri-Nighty killer. It's about what the Tri-Nighty killer cost. The season spent 12 episodes building toward a finale in which Dexter succeeds. He catches Trinity, he kills Trinity, he does what he set out to do. And then he goes home and finds Rita dead in the bathtub. He wins the contest completely and loses everything that mattered. That inversion, victory followed immediately by the worst possible consequence, is what made Season 4 the emotional center of the franchise. Resurrection Season 1 echoes that structure in a quieter way. Dexter wins, Prater is dead, Harrison is safe, Dexter has the files, he's free and operating. The victory is real, and yet, standing just outside the frame of that victory, the Ripper's name appears in a file. Something is already in motion that the victory didn't address. Good Dexter seasons have always worked that way. The win doesn't close everything down. The win opens something else. What Season 2 presumably does is take that new opening and make it costly. Not immediately, not through a single twist, but progressively, across the season, through the specific kind of accumulating pressure that this show does when it's working well. The Ripper doesn't just need to be caught, he needs to cost Dexter something. The five-borough killer doesn't just need to be stopped. His presence in the story needs to change something about who Dexter is or what Harrison becomes. The best Dexter seasons always identify what the protagonist is most afraid of losing and then put that thing in direct danger. Season 4 put the family in danger. Season 7 put Deborah's soul in danger. Season 1 of Resurrection put the Harrison relationship in danger. The question for Season 2 is what Dexter is most afraid of losing now that the Harrison reconciliation has happened. The answer, I think, is Harrison himself. Not his safety, but his trajectory. Dexter survived New Blood and got on a plane to New York to find Harrison not because he needed something from Harrison, but because Harrison was the only reason to keep surviving. Harrison choosing to become a cop, choosing to build something, choosing to not be what their shared history could have made him, that choice is what Dexter is holding on to. The most powerful threat Season 2 can deploy is something that puts that choice in jeopardy. Harrison killing deliberately, Harrison discovering Dexter's latest body, Harrison having to decide again whether his father deserves to exist. Not because the show needs to reset, they've done that, but because the question of whether the cycle breaks is the most important question in the franchise's remaining life, and the answer shouldn't come easily. There's a piece of confirmed casting detail that feeds into this rather directly. Bokeem Woodbine as Captain Mixon. Woodbine is an actor with a specific quality. He plays authority figures with genuine weight, people whose judgment you trust until you find you shouldn't, or should, but in a different way than you expected. Mixon, running a homicide squad and his daughter being Harrison's love interest, puts institutional authority in the most personal possible proximity to what Dexter is. Mixon doesn't know who he's inviting into his professional and personal life when Harrison comes along. That gap between what Mixon thinks he knows and what is actually true is where Season 2's most consequential human moments will probably live. One last thing about the historical pattern that feels relevant here. The franchise has never managed to stick the landing when it comes to finales. Season 4 is the exception, and even that finale is really the consequence of the twist rather than a satisfying structural conclusion. The original series finale was widely considered a disappointment. New Blood's finale divided the audience sharply. Resurrection Season 1's finale was better received than either of those, which suggests the showrunner learned something. The 3-season plan is an opportunity to plan an ending properly, to know where you're going when you're still in the middle of the journey, which is the one thing the franchise has historically not had. If they use that opportunity well, this could be the ending that Dexter Morgan actually deserves after 20 years. Not the most dramatic ending necessarily, just the most honest one. One of the things that Season 1 of Resurrection did quietly and well was resist making the Harrison-Dexter reconciliation clean. They arrived at something. There was a genuine emotional movement between the two of them across those 10 episodes. And by the finale, the relationship felt less like a wound and more like a work in progress, which is exactly right. A father who told his son to shoot him in the snow and a son who pulled the trigger don't resolve into a normal relationship just because they've spent a season in the same city. What they arrive at is something more like a provisional trust. Harrison accepts that Dexter survived. Dexter accepts that Harrison is going to make his own choices, including the choice to become a cop. They're not the same people they were in New Blood. They're also not starting fresh. They're holding what happened between them and trying to figure out what to do with it, which is genuinely the most realistic version of how this relationship could exist. Season 2 presumably starts from that provisional trust and applies pressure to it. The specific way the show is positioned to apply that pressure is through Harrison's new life. The cop career, the love interest, the social world he's building in New York. All of that is a version of normality that Harrison is constructing carefully, and that Dexter's continued existence genuinely threatens. Every time Dexter kills someone in New York, he creates a risk. Every body in the water is a thread that could unravel Harrison's life if it's followed far enough. Harrison knows what his father is. Harrison has made a kind of peace with it, provisionally, but peace made in the abstract is different from peace tested by proximity. The theory that I keep returning to for Season 2 is that at some point Harrison has to decide again, not whether Dexter should live. The show already went there in New Blood and isn't going to repeat the same choice, but whether Dexter can continue operating in the world Harrison is trying to build. Whether the man Harrison is choosing to become can coexist with the man his father refuses to stop being. That's a richer version of the conflict than the straightforward, will Harrison become a killer question, which tends to get most of the fan theory oxygen. Harrison might kill again. But the more interesting question is what he does about Dexter. That question has a different shape now than it did in New Blood because the circumstances are different. Harrison isn't catching Dexter by surprise, isn't acting from a place of shock and betrayal. He knows. He chose to maintain the relationship knowing. which means any future decision about Dexter is made with full information, which makes it a different moral weight entirely. There's a smaller but specific theory about Harrison's new girlfriend, Captain Mixon's daughter on the homicide squad, that plays into this in an interesting way. The theory holds that she's not just a love interest, but a structural threat to Harrison's cover story. A homicide detective who is close to Harrison, who meets Dexter, who is good at her job. She's the character most positioned in Season 2 to start asking the right questions. Not about Dexter's past necessarily, but about Harrison's own. About the Ryan Foster situation. About the things Harrison doesn't talk about from the year before he arrived in New York. A good detective in a relationship with someone who has things to hide is one of those slow-moving structural dangers that the show does well when it commits to it. And then there's the question of Gigi, who is Harrison's existing girlfriend from Season 1. The show seems to be moving Harrison toward the new love interest, the captain's daughter, which implies Gigi's role either diminishes or becomes something else. There's a theory that Gigi is the one who discovers something about Dexter, about Harrison, precisely because she's not a trained investigator and therefore approaches whatever she finds with a civilian's horror rather than a detective's process. That kind of discovery tends to be less controlled, less predictable, and therefore potentially more dangerous than an institutional investigation. New York deserves more attention than it usually gets in Dexter discussions because the setting isn't incidental. Every city this franchise has used has shaped how the story runs. Miami was Dexter's city in the deepest sense. He grew up there. He knew its rhythms, its heat, its social geography. He knew which neighborhoods were watched and which weren't, where bodies would be found quickly and where they wouldn't, which officers worked which beats. That familiarity was both his greatest operational asset and the thing that eventually closed in on him. Familiarity runs both ways, and the people who eventually came closest to catching him were the ones who had watched him long enough in that familiar context to notice the inconsistencies. Iron Lake was the opposite, unfamiliar to Dexter in ways he didn't fully account for. A small town where everyone knows everyone, where a stranger is visible by definition, where the social compression meant that secrets had nowhere to hide. New Blood's tragedy was partly about a man who thought he could disappear in smallness and found that smallness is a kind of exposure. New York sits in a genuinely interesting middle register. It's enormous and anonymous, which works in Dexter's favor. But it's also a city with one of the most watched, most resourced, most interconnected law enforcement apparatus in the country. New York has layers of jurisdiction, NYPD, federal agencies, investigative units with specific mandates that don't exist in Miami Metro or Iron Lake's single-station setup. The complexity of that environment is both cover and complication. The practical implication for Season 2 is that Dexter is operating in a city where one wrong move doesn't just produce a local investigation. It produces layers of scrutiny that can come from multiple directions simultaneously. Detective Wallace's cold case unit is one thread. Captain Mixon's homicide squad, which will presumably have some awareness of cases that touch his daughter's social life, is another. If reports are accurate that Quinn comes into the picture with his own angle on Dexter, that's a third. 3 concurrent investigative threads, all with different information, all capable of combining into something decisive if they ever share what they know. The original series never quite had that configuration, and I think it's actually the right shape for where Dexter is now. Someone who has survived too long and knows too many people in too many contexts. The city also gives Dexter a different kind of camouflage than he's had before. In Miami, he was a known quantity. Face at the precinct, a specialist who got called in, someone colleagues had opinions about. In New York, he's nobody in particular, that's useful. But nobody in particular also means no institutional access, no badge, no reason to be at crime scenes. The forensics background that served him so well for 8 seasons in Miami is worth much less in a city where he has no professional standing. He's working from the files, from observation, from whatever access he can construct. That's a more precarious operational position than anything he's had before, and it'll show in how Season 2 is structured. There's one specific theory about how Dexter navigates this constraint that I find plausible. He finds a way to get eyes inside the investigation through Harrison. Not directly, not in a way Harrison explicitly consents to, but simply by being close enough to a person who is inside the system to receive incidental information. That's uncomfortable territory for both of them, and the show might not go there deliberately. But the proximity is there, and proximity in this franchise has always eventually produced consequences. The single most discussed theory by volume is probably still some variation of Harrison kills someone and has to hide it. We've touched on this in a few different contexts already, and the reason it keeps recurring is that it's the most structurally necessary thing that could happen to develop Harrison's arc. He's already been in a situation that required Dexter to cover for him. The next step, narratively, is for Harrison to be in a situation where Dexter isn't available to cover, or where covering would cost something significant, or where Harrison himself has to make the decision about what to do with what he's done. That's the story that doesn't exist yet, and clearly needs to. The second most discussed category is variations on who discovers Dexter this season, which is a recurring franchise question, almost a formula at this point, and yet it keeps being interesting because the circumstances are always different. The candidates in fan discussion are Detective Wallace, professional cold case focused, Captain Mixon, institutional proximity through Harrison, the captain's daughter, personal proximity through Harrison, Blessing Kamara, domestic proximity, possibly fellow dangerous person, and the wild card of Quinn arriving from the original series with personal motivation. My read on this is that the discovery in Season 2, if it happens, is probably partial rather than complete. The franchise works best when someone almost gets there and the almost costs something. La Guertu almost got there in Season 7. It cost Deborah everything. Angela actually got there in New Blood. It cost the stability of Dexter's carefully constructed new life. The complete discovery, the moment when someone with sufficient authority knows everything and can prove it. That's probably the Season 3 culminating event rather than Season 2's. Season 2 narrows the distance, Season 3 closes it. There's also a recurring thread in fan discussion about the Harry to Harrison transmission. The idea that as Dexter's need for the Harry conscience figure fades, Harrison might start having his own version of it. Not Harry specifically, but a voice, a framework he's building or trying to build for himself. Some fans have theorized this would take the form of Harrison hearing Dexter's voice the way Dexter heard Harry's, which is a neatly horrifying bit of symmetry, a son whose interior conscience is his killer father's narration. Whether the show goes there or not, the instinct behind the theory is sound. Harrison is at the stage in his development that Dexter was at, around the time Harry formalized the code. He's got the capacity and the question of what to do with it. Someone or something is going to have to give him a framework. One theory that I find underexplored in most of the coverage is what happens to Dexter's own moral framework now that the code is being applied in a completely different operational context. The code was always situational. Harry designed it for Miami, for Dexter's specific professional access, for a specific set of constraints. None of those constraints apply in New York. Dexter is working from files rather than crime scenes. He doesn't have institutional access. He's making decisions about targets based on Prater's documentation rather than his own investigation. That's a different standard of certainty than the code traditionally required, and the show might choose to address that discrepancy directly. What does guilty beyond reasonable doubt mean when the evidence comes from a dead billionaire's obsession files rather than from police work? The most interesting version of Season 2 probably asks that question explicitly at some point. Not as a philosophical detour, but as a practical crisis. What if one of Prater's targets turns out to be wrong? What if the documentation is inaccurate, or out of date, or was planted? What if Dexter acts on the files and acts wrong? The code has never fully reckoned with that possibility because Dexter has always been the one verifying the evidence. He's not doing that now, or not fully. That gap could be where Season 2 finds one of its more uncomfortable moments. One thing that doesn't get enough attention in Dexter theory discussions is what the show sounds like, which matters more than most people give it credit for. Daniel Licht composed the original series score, and Pat Irwin composed the score for New Blood. His work was distinctive in a very specific way. Eerie, Latin-inflected, with a kind of tropical strangeness that felt exactly right for Miami, and then, surprisingly, translated into the colder New England setting of New Blood without losing its character. Licht passed away in 2017, which is a loss the franchise acknowledged quietly when New Blood aired. His score was present even posthumously in that series, in the sense that the sonic identity he created had become so embedded in what Dexter sounds like that any replacement composer would be working in conversation with it. For Resurrection, Pat Irwin took over composing duties. And the shift matters because Irwin comes from a different tradition. He's known for work that is more overtly metropolitan, more angular, better suited to urban environments than Licht's warmly strange tropical noir. New York Dexter sounds different from Miami Dexter, and that's partly intentional. The city has an edge that Iron Lake and Miami, in their very different ways, didn't. Irwin's score for Season 1 was noted by several reviewers as genuinely effective. Not just competent service scoring, but something that added texture to the New York setting in ways that reinforced what the writing was doing. For Season 2, the score becomes important in a slightly different way. If the Ripper storyline is built around psychological menace rather than action sequences, if the confrontation with Don Frampt is as much cerebral as it is physical, the music does a lot of work in establishing what kind of threat we're dealing with. A score that is tense but not propulsive, unsettling but not frantic. The kind of underscore that makes you feel the weight of the cold case reopening. The patience of a very old wrong being slowly exposed. That's a specific tonal challenge, and Irwin has, based on Season 1, the toolkit for it. The other thing worth noting about what Resurrection is doing differently from the franchise's recent history is its relationship to the audience's expectations. New Blood aired as a kind of apology for Season 8. It was positioned explicitly and implicitly as the show trying to make right on a bad ending. That's a lot of weight to carry, and New Blood buckled under some of it while succeeding in other places. Resurrection doesn't have that relationship to its predecessor. It can just be a television show. It doesn't have to be corrective. And television shows that are freed from that corrective mandate tend to be more creatively relaxed, more willing to take risks, less defensive in their choices. The 95% critic score that Season 1 achieved is not just a vanity metric. It tells you that the show, for the first time in a long time, wasn't being evaluated primarily against what it needed to fix. It was being evaluated as what it actually was. That's a better position from which to make Season 2. The fan engagement has been strong too. The theories, the discussions, the continued conversation about Don Frampt and Harrison and Blessing in the months between the Season 1 finale and the Season 2 production start. All of that is the sign of an audience that is genuinely invested rather than just obligated. People don't spend months theorizing about shows they're lukewarm on. The fact that the Clyde Phillips quote about Don Frampt spread as quickly as it did, that Resurrection fan spaces have been active and engaged since September 2025. That the casting announcements for Season 2 generated real conversation rather than polite acknowledgement. These are good signs. Late 2026 is the target window. There's a lot to think about between now and then, and we've covered most of it tonight. The rest will have to wait for the episodes themselves. A few smaller things that didn't fit neatly into the main sections but seem worth mentioning before we're done. The Trinity Killer prequel series. An announcement has been made about a spin-off focused on Arthur Mitchell's early life and first kills in the 1970s. Announced casting, no premiere date, plenty of meaningful detail beyond the concept. But the fact of its existence is interesting for a few reasons. The 1970s setting places it entirely before any character we know in the franchise. Harry Morgan would have been a young man. Arthur Mitchell would be in the period where whatever made him what he was forming. It's genuinely unexplored territory, and the 1970s as a setting has its own texture and visual language that is very different from the Miami of the original series. Whether it crosses into the Resurrection timeline at any point, whether there's a character bridge or a thematic bridge, is unknown. It might be entirely self-contained. But it's a sign that the franchise is thinking in terms of breadth as well as sequel depth. The show is also no longer on Netflix in the United States. That might sound like a footnote, but it actually matters for how new viewers find the franchise and whether Resurrection Season 2 gets the kind of discovery audience that Season 1 benefited from. Consolidating on Paramount Plus with Showtime makes sense from a corporate standpoint, but it does reduce the show's visibility somewhat for casual browsers. This is probably more of a business concern than a creative one, but it shapes the context the show is working in. Neil Patrick Harris and John Lithgow both had guest roles in Season 1. I've mentioned Lithgow in the context of Trinity and Harris in the context of against typecasting. Neither has been confirmed or denied for Season 2, which is the standard approach the show takes to guest appearances. You don't know until you're watching. Both would presumably require narrative justification rather than just nostalgia, and the show seemed aware of that in how it used them in Season 1. One thing I find genuinely uncertain about Season 2, and it's worth naming as uncertain rather than dressing it up as a theory, is the pacing question. Season 1 ran 10 episodes, which is the standard for the expanded franchise. 10 episodes is actually quite short for the amount of story Resurrection was telling. The show managed it, but there were moments where the density showed. Season 2 is introducing multiple new killers, a new love interest for Harrison, the Wallace cold case coming to a head, and whatever Dexter is doing with the files and Al Walker and everything else. 10 episodes for all of that is ambitious. Whether the pacing holds or whether the show feels crowded will be one of the first things reviewers note when the season lands. That uncertainty aside, I'm genuinely looking forward to it. Not in the anxious, please don't disappoint me way that New Blood inspired. That wariness born of having been disappointed before. More in the straightforward sense of having something interesting to watch. A story that is still generating real questions, characters whose arcs aren't fully written. That's a position the Dexter franchise hasn't been in for quite a while. The season will come around eventually. Until then, there's plenty to think about. One thing that keeps coming back to me when I think about Resurrection Season 2 in context is just how long this franchise has been running and what that longevity actually means. October 2006 is when Dexter premiered. That's nearly 2 decades ago. Michael C. Hall was 35 years old. The show arrived at a moment in television history that was genuinely significant. The expansion of prestige cable drama, the growing acceptance of anti-heroes as protagonists, the particular American appetite in the mid-2000s for moral complexity in entertainment. Dexter was part of a wave alongside The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, The Wire, shows that asked audiences to live inside the perspective of people doing terrible things and to keep watching without being given a clean reason to feel comfortable about it. The difference between Dexter and most of that wave is that Dexter is still going. Tony Soprano is dead in the on-screen narrative, and James Gandolfini has passed in real life. Walter White concluded definitively, McNulty is wherever McNulty ended up. Dexter Morgan survived being shot by his son in the snow, got on a plane, moved to New York, and is now working through a list of serial killers sourced from a dead billionaire's vault. That's a genuinely remarkable thing. The character has outlasted almost everything that was adjacent to it. Whether that's a good thing or just a durable thing is a question I find myself genuinely uncertain about. Longevity in television is not automatically a virtue. Sometimes shows end at the right moment, and the ending makes everything before it feel complete. Sometimes they keep going, and the accumulated weight of seasons that shouldn't have existed is what people remember. Resurrection Season 1. felt to me like the franchise arguing that it still had something to say. Not just a continuation, but a genuine reason to continue. That argument landed well enough that Season 2 exists and Season 3 is planned. Whether those seasons make good on the argument is the whole question. But tonight we have the theories. We have the confirmed details. We have Brian Cox and Dan Stevens and Harrison deciding to become a cop and a retired killer named Don Frampt, who has been sending voicemails into the dark for 20 years. We have October 2026 as a target. We have plenty of time. I hope it was a good evening. Sleep well.